All right, maybe we can get started. Good. So welcome everyone. My name is Aurélien Bellet. I'm one of the co-organizers of this Federated Learning One Word seminar, along with Peter Richterich, who is here also, Virginia Smith, Dan Alistar, and also Samuel Rovat, who is here too and handles most of the logistics. So the goal of the seminar for people who are first joiners is to provide a forum to discuss the latest results in all aspects of federated learning. So this includes a lot of topics like distributed optimization, the more learning algorithms, privacy and crypto, personalization, communication compression, systems, hardwares, and applications. Today will be actually an instance of a more applied talk. So the speaker today is Mathieu Andreu. Thanks a lot for accepting our invite. So Mathieu is a senior data scientist at Owkin, which is a French-based company in the domain of AI for medical research. Mathieu received a PhD in machine learning and signal processing from École Normale Supérieure in France in 2018. And today he will tell us about applications of federated learning in collaborative clinical research. So thanks a lot, Mathieu. Just before you start, maybe just to make sure everybody knows this, how we proceed to ask questions. So basically during the talk, all the mics are off by default for the audience. And so the idea is that you can use the raise hand feature in the participants menu or write your question in the chat, and then Samuel and I can either ask the question for you or we can turn on your mic so you can ask your question yourself. Okay, that's it. Thanks a lot. So Mathieu, the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks a lot, Aurélien, for the introduction, and thanks for the invitation to speak here. It's a pleasure to be here today and to talk. And as Aurélien mentioned, there is a room for questions. Please do not hesitate to ask any. I'd be happy to take them. So before I start, let me start with a small disclaimer about what this presentation isn't about. So as I already mentioned, this is going to be an applied talk, so I won't talk about a new generic federated learning algorithm. I won't talk about convergence theorems and guarantees in the distributed setting, convex or non-convex or whatever. And even if it's applications, I won't be talking about scaling FL to hundreds of millions of devices. Instead, I'm going to talk about applications of federated learning, but to clinical research problems, which is a slightly different setting than the original federated learning framework. I'm going to discuss some changes that we encountered along the way and some small solutions that we devised. And mainly this talk is going to be about open problems. And my hope is to convince you that this setting where we're looking about clinical applied research problem, mainly for quite a few devices, but not that many, is still very interesting and very rich in terms of scientific problems. My talk will be divided in 3 parts. First, I'll make some generic observations about what's clinical research and why collaborative federated learning can play a role. Then I'll present the first application of federated learning to histopathology classification. And then I'll dive into the application of federated learning for survival analysis. I'm going to start now with clinical research. First, I'll define what clinical research is and how machine learning learning in general can help it. Then how, in particular, federated learning and collaborative federated learning can contribute to clinical research. And then I'll define more precisely what I mean by collaborative federated learning. So clinical research, what I'm going to talk about is mainly drug development. So drug development is a process of taking a candidate molecule that was found by drug discovery and passing through different scientific phases to get it market approved. You may have heard of these different phases with the COVID-19 pandemic and the efforts that are done to develop vaccines, and each of these phases looks at different properties of the candidate molecule and has a different number of people involved. This, whatever the drug, this drug development process is characterized by 2 phenomena. The first one is a very low success rate. This is a figure taken for Dowden and Monroe, and it shows the probability of having a drug getting market approved, knowing that it starts at some phase. And what's interesting here is the probability of getting market approved at the beginning of the pipeline, And you can see here that, of course, there are variations depending on the kind of drug, but overall it's quite low, with a success rate lower than 10%. Meaning that, so it fails a lot. And related to this issue, but not entirely, there's a phenomenon called Eron's law, which is index for Moore's law, that costs of bringing drugs to market have been rising exponentially over time. This is a figure taken from Scannell and co-authors, and it shows the logarithm of the number of drugs that are brought to market for a constant billion US dollars. And what you can see is that it follows a line with a negative slope. So costs have been rising exponentially, and around 2000, we passed the point where it took more than $1 billion to bring a single drug to market. It's more like 2 billion. So drug development is high failure rate, very costly, and is slowing down therapy development. And we can see it's an issue. And this is where machine learning has an opportunity to speed up the process. There are catalysts for this. The first one is the increased digitalization of patient data. Nowadays, it's routine. There are some routine analyses such as imaging, genomic data, as well as electronic health reports, which are being digitalized. There's also has been a tremendous drive in machine learning and deep learning over the last decade, which makes it possible to analyze imaging data and genomic data. And finally, there has been large nationwide databases which are being created and collected over time, such as the very nice UK Biobank data, which collects data from 500,000 people over decades, as well as the Cancer Genome Atlas in the US for cancer data. And machine learning can play a role for clinical trial optimization, to reduce costs, for instance. Here's a non-exhaustive list of how we can be used. The first one is the creation of predictive biomarkers and signatures, meaning that a machine learning algorithm will help to identify some biological features of the patients, which then will act as new features, which can then be used to structure the clinical trial. You can look, for instance, at a nice paper of Korshel and co-authors and Galato and co-authors who found such a new biomarker with machine learning. These biomarkers can then be used to define high-value patient subgroups. So by high value, I mean patients for which a drug will have a very high impact, much better than on the general population, mainly because we already have good drugs and bringing new drugs is increasingly difficult. And so we will be able to find a good population, good responders. Another point where it can be used is to define surrogate endpoints, meaning defining monitoring quantities which can be easily measured to monitor how the clinical trial goes and understand if it's failing early or not. And finally, and this is very interesting, there's a possibility to create synthetic arms powered by counterfactual outcomes from previous data, meaning that you don't need to have a placebo arm, you simply have all the patients given the drug, and the placebo arm is digitalized, is synthetic, and still you're able to get some power. And these things work, in fact. This is a figure taken from the data of the study of Ballard and co-author. And what you can see is that to reach some statistical power, to be able to detect some statistical difference in some response, with the use of additional biomarkers from the patient, you're able to diminish the number of patients needed to reach this statistical power. So, and it's quite significant, meaning that you need to enroll fewer patients and therefore reduce the cost. So all is nice. We can use machine learning for clinical research, except that for machine learning, the more data, the better for generalization performance. And in fact, clinical data sharing isn't always possible or easy. There are, of course, regulations which are coming, which make it difficult to share data. There is also the fact that some data are held by private actors, and they see this data as an asset that they, with intellectual property, they do not want to lose. And we enter here in the so-called coopetitive framework, where there are some competitors which do not want to abandon the datasets, but they still want to cooperate. A real-world example of this framework is Melody, which is a European consortium between 10 pharmaceutical companies aiming at improving their drug discovery machine learning models without sharing their datasets. And this lack of clinical data sharing is an issue, especially for rare diseases, because for rare diseases, even though it's possible to build nationwide databases, it doesn't make sense to build a nationwide databases. Only continental or world databases are useful for very rare diseases. And this is where collaborative federating plays a role. It's a possibility for different institutions to collaborate to perform a common machine learning training. If you want to learn more about the possibilities for using machine learning and federated learning in particular for clinical research, I point you to the recent review of Ricky and co-authors, which was much more in depth on this topic. So, I've mentioned collaborative federated learning. What does it mean? So for those of you who have read the very nice and long review of Karouz and many co-authors end of last year, it's akin to the cross-silo effect, meaning that we have a few centers, say 1, 2, 2K, and all of them hold some data sets, N1 and 2 NK, and they have a local machine learning model. And their goal is to improve the machine learning model performance through collaboration. And that collaboration will be performed by exchanging some machine learning related quantities to a central node called the aggregator. These machine learning quantities can be, for instance, gradients or differences in weights and dependency in weights. This setting is characterized as follows. There are few centers. Typically, the number of centers is smaller than 100, and in what I'm going to present, it's more going to be like 5 or 10. Contrary to the cross-device setting, the local datasets are quite large. You can see that you can write it like this, saying that they do not differ from the total number of samples. Meaning that it's very difficult to improve the performance because already each center is already able to train a model, which is good. During training, there is full participation of all centers. There is no, I mean, we can of course remove them, but it's not necessary. The participants are stateful. They can store data during training between the different rounds, and moreover, they have large computing power locally. And there is quite a good internet connection between one another. Finally, because we're talking about some collaboration, all participants have an interest to collaborate and to have a good training. Therefore, we assume an honest but curious privacy setting. So the centers will simply try to glean and to take as much information as they can from the data from the other centers, but they won't try to ruin the training. So there are quite a few machine learning challenges in this setting. I'm mainly drawing from the reviews of Karouz and Ricky. The first challenge is simply machine learning. One issue is, can you really federate any machine learning model? When you're talking about applications, it's quite an important question. For instance, can you really federate any biostatistical model of interest? Can you federate in particular trees, decision trees, which are really useful for some kind of data sets? Another issue is heterogeneity, and this comes in two kinds. The first one is data alignment. Because data isn't produced by a software which is shared by all the different centers and which makes it very easy to harmonize the data, here we have datasets which are produced by humans with different protocols, different countries, different languages. And even the data element issue to create the machine learning problem is a problem. Then, of course, even when all the datasets, all the features are aligned, there is the statistical issue that the different statistical distributions of the points won't be the same on all the centers. And this can ruin the training. Another issue is privacy. In particular, what do the intermediate quantity which are exchanged for training and the final model which are delivered to the different centers leak on all the individual center patients' data. Finally, even if we are assuming good connection, there's still a problem in communication because, as I mentioned, there are good. We're looking at medical imaging, so the medical imaging involves some very large images, and because we have good computing power, we would like to use very large machine learning models and so communication is still an issue in this setting. In this talk, I'm mainly going to focus on these two issues, on the federation of particular machine learning models and the interplay with heterogeneity. Now I think I'm going to make a short break to take questions if there are.
Okay, there's two questions from Konstantin Volachenko in the chat. I'll try to meet you. You can ask yourself.
Yes. So the first question is, what are biomarkers? From what data structures these markers are calculated? So it's a good question. So a biomarker, it's simply a marker that can be monitored biologically. For instance, it can be expression of some gene. It's a generic term, but the thing is you don't know what biomarker plays a role for which drug. And machine learning can help to find predictive biomarkers for a given drug, for instance, a given response. And then on the second question,
sorry, can you please also comment about question one? So first of all, I don't have really clinical background in chemical and biology too, but in terms of data structures, so these biomarkers, they're calculated, evaluated based on some voxel data, scans, some graph structures.
It's a generic term, it can be any structure. It can be some, if you've got genomic data, it can be a genomic expression. If you've got some imaging, some voxels, it can be some patterns. It is not well defined from a machine learning perspective.
Okay, yeah. Second question, yeah, from me about what machine learning problems you use, I mean, or people use in clinical research. Is it like classical regression classification, or it is something another? So can you comment?
Yes, this is a very good question. In fact, I'm going to go through very particular clinical models. So people sometimes use segmentation, classification, regression, but one of a very important class of models is survival models. And I'm going to detail classification and survival models in what follows.
Thank you.
Okay, so it seems there are no other questions to continue.
Okay, so I'm going to continue. Thanks a lot, Konstantin. I've mentioned, so here I've presented broadly the topic. Now let me go through a first application, which is histopathology classification in an NFL setting. What I'm going to present now is mainly extracted from short papers that we've written with colleagues from Okin, Jean-Gilles Dutara, Constance Béguier, and Eric Trammell, which is going to be presented to a MICAI workshop later this year. Okay. So in the title of this part, there is histopathology. What's histopathology? It's a branch of biology which studies tissue under a microscope. So you take some biopsy of a tissue of a patient, you slice it, and you put it under the microscope, and you look at it. Typically, you take a picture, for instance, if you want to digitalize it, but otherwise, you let a human look at it. And you can see all these structures with cells, and different, you can observe the tumors, for instance, etc. These images are very large. In fact, the typical number of pixels is like 100,000 pixels times 100,000 pixels, which makes it pretty interesting to tackle from a machine learning perspective. And histopathology is the golden standard, for instance, for cancer grade classification, because the biologists have a lot of words to describe all the different patterns that the tumors can have, depending on their shapes, which they sometimes call biomarkers. And in this part, I'm going to talk about tile classification. So I have a slide here, which is a piece of tissue, which was stained and then put under the microscope. And some experts have already annotated it and found the tumorous regions here in blue. And the task is given a subpart of the image, a tile, to predict if this tile contains some tumorous region or not. Which is going to be a tumoral status, and it's a binary classification problem. We're going to typically solve this problem with a deep convolutional neural network because it is a medical imaging, it's an image which is quite small and it fits into standard architectures. Okay, And so we in a federated setting, so we have different centers, each of them holding some data sets with some tiles here and some response, some label 0, 1. Does this tile contain tumor cells or not? Each center has K has this data set ZK, and the goal is to minimize the global loss function with respect to the parameter theta of the predictor, which is nothing but a weighted sum of the local empirical risk losses, where the risk is taken with respect to the prediction of the network. This is standard federated learning, and you can solve it using, for instance, your favorite federated averaging variant. So you can start with, let me recall how federated averaging works. You start with the aggregator initializes the weights of the model with some theta 0. And then for t going from, for all rounds, t, the current version of the weights is sent to the different centers. Then on each center in parallel, there is a local optimization which is performed. We would say E step, where E can denote epochs or number of batch updates, depending on how you look at it. And LK is going to be your local loss. And so each center is going to produce a modified version tied to its own data, theta t plus 1k. And then each center sends back this updated version to the aggregator, which simply averages the different versions with weights proportional to the number of samples held locally. Okay, so I'm talking about DeepNet, which fits into the FL framework, so everything is solved, right? In fact, it's not necessarily solved for two reasons. The first one is heterogeneity of histopathology data. Here I'm showing slides which are coming from the dataset by Bundy and co-authors from Chameleon 17. And what you can see is that the colors vary because in each center there are different chemical reactants which are used to produce the staining which then react with the cells. And so because there are slight variations in these reactants, there are variations in the stainings. And if you look at it from, if you look at the marginal color distributions on two different centers, you see variations, and it's quite significant. And this may negatively affect training, as for instance, Yi and co-authors have found recently. Another issue is that because we're looking at an imaging problem, we like to use batch normalization. Batch normalization is a crucial layer. It's used in, my computer is freezing. Yeah, no, so it's a crucial layer which is used in almost every modern CNN architecture when you want to do end-to-end training on a deep network. Here I'm listing a few of the recent state-of-the-art networks. ResNet, Swiss and Excitation-Net, EfficientNet, all of them have batch norm. Let me recall how batch norm, which was proposed by Yoff and Szegedy in 2015, works. So it's a layer from a network. So it takes as input some X, which has some a tensor with a batch dimension, some channels and a spatial dimension, and outputs some a tensor which has the same shape. And batch norm has two steps. The first one is a normalization step, where there are mu and sigma, which are supposed to represent the mean of X across channels and the variance of X also along the different channels. And X is first normalized, getting X hat. And then there are two other parameters, gamma and beta, which rescale this normalized version to produce the batch norm output. So there are these four different parameters in a batch normalization layer, but they don't play the same role. Mu and sigma are batch norm statistics, meaning they are running means and variances computed across iterations. And in fact, during training, there's an edge from X to these different tensors because mu and sigma are going to be updated throughout the different mini batches with computation of X, of the mean and the variance of X along the batch axis and the spatial dimension. On the other hand, gamma and beta are standard trainable parameters which can be fixed by gradient descent. And the fact that we have here during training some mean which is taking along the batch axis makes it that even with one local mini batch step, batch norm isn't defined well in the federated learning setting Contrary, for instance, to federated SGD, where when you do one local mini-batch step, it's up to the sampling issues, it's roughly equivalent to what happens in the pool setting. Because we're taking a mean across a batch axis, computing the network on a large batch made of small mini-batches coming from the different centers is not equivalent to computing the network on all the small mini-batches and concatenating the outputs. In fact, you can solve this issue by computing, if you want to retrieve exact pool equivalent computations, you can communicate all intermediate activation statistics, like you're going to compute the mean here and the variance here, and you're going to average it across all the different batches in the different centers, average them, send them back to the different workers for all the mini batches for all the BN layers. So of course, it's completely infeasible for communication reasons, because it's going to take a lot of time, and for privacy reasons, because you're going to share statistics, mini-batch statistics on all centers, and it can be pretty sensitive. So there are many ways to circumvent this issue. The simplest is probably to try a federated averaging approach, meaning instead of wanting to keep the equivalence with pool, we're simply gonna update the mini-batch statistics, the batch norm statistics locally, and then we will average them only periodically. And it's a strategy that one can think of. Does it work? So here I'm computing the performance AUC, so higher is better, of a network trained, so this network has been layers trained on 2 different datasets, Chameleon 16 and 17. This one has 2 centers, this one has 5 centers, and I'm comparing the performance of pooled, local, and federated averaging with different number of local batch objects. And what you can see is that federated averaging isn't even able to retrieve something which is as good as the local performance, average local performance across centers. And if you control by taking a network, a similar network, but without batch norm layers, what you observe is that federated averaging is able to get such a good performance, meaning that there is something really at play with the batch norm layers. So there are different ways to solve it. You could think of simply removing the batch norm and using group normalization. But here in this work, we were more interested in still using batch norm, and there are good reasons for that. We were inspired by this work of Lee and co-authors, which is called adaptive batch normalization, which shows that not all batch norm parameters are alike, and that statistics play a very specific role. So adaptive batch norm is a work which studies domain adaptation. So you train a single network on a domain A. You end up with some batch norm statistics for all batch norm layers, some batch norm weights, and other neural networks parameters. And what AdaBN proposes is when one transfers this neural network to another domain, is to keep unchanged the batch norm weights and the other neural network parameters, but to recompute the batch norm statistics on domain B, which is feasible provided you have access to a few inputs on the domain B. And the new batch norm statistics are then adapted to this new domain. And what the authors showed in this paper is that it can improve the performance on the new domain. For instance, here's an instance of a segmentation task, where a network has been trained on different images, and here one wants to segment the clouds. This is the result of the network without using AdaBN, but when one uses AdaBN on these kinds of images, the performance is really better. So from this work, we conclude that batch norm statistics are tied to a given data distribution, while other neural networks weights can be exchanged between domains. And in fact, it's good because if they're tied to a given data distribution, they'll be able to better adapt to the heterogeneity of the data. To be able, because they're used to centers, they'll be able to center all points to a single value. And that's why we propose a method called SiloBN, where simply we do not share the batch norm statistics at all. All batch norm statistics remain local. They are dependent on the, here it's an hospital, can be whatever, and only the batch norm weights and the other standard neural network parameters are shared at the aggregation step. There are two benefits of this approach. The first one is model personalization, because in this approach, we're going to end up with a different, there will be a core of parameters which are going to be shared across all networks, but then some weights, these batch norm statistics are going to be tied to each center. And it's good because it means that the models are going to be personalized, and probably it can help to improve locally the performance. And this is what our goal is, in particular in this collaborative setting. Each center has an incentive to improve its performance over its local performance. And then there's a side effect in terms of privacy. Because we are not sharing all the batch norm layers, we are not sharing even the server doesn't know the total function, doesn't know what it's like. So maybe there is a way to retrieve some blueprint, fingerprint of the batch norm statistic from the other weights. We haven't investigated this question, but probably it shares less information, so it should help a little bit in terms of weights. So we have tested this approach. These are the results I presented before. As always, higher is better. And here was what happened when I plug in SiloBN on the picture. What you can see is that the performance is much better on both datasets compared to naive federated averaging, where one shares the batch norm statistics. Then we have also studies inter-center generalization, meaning we train on some centers from this dataset, and we evaluate it on another dataset. And when we transfer, we use adaptive batch norm if required, because our network doesn't, the central value held by the server doesn't have the batch norm weights, batch norm statistics, so it needs to use ADAB. And we compare ourselves to federated averaging with a network which doesn't have batch norm layers, because the other one, federated averaging with batch norm layers, proved to be very poor. And what we observe is that, so depending on the centers, one or the other gets the best result, but on average, it improves the transfer performance. So to conclude, we've investigated histopathology classification in an FL setting, and even if the problem is well framed from a machine learning perspective and federative learning perspective, there are some issues, especially when looking at the batch norm, and we propose the algorithm called SiloBN to circumvent it. Are there any questions at this stage?
Okay, we have one question. I will try to unmute Hassan.
Hi,
please go ahead.
Hi, thank you so much. So I have a question. Maybe you covered it and I missed it. So I'm curious that if we do, let's say, a smart ensembling of models from these multi-site ensemble, how close do we get to these results to federated learning?
Thank you. This is a good question. So in fact, in this work in particular, we did not look at the performance of the ensemble, probably because it depends on the data set. If you look, for instance, here at Chameleon 716, because the local performance are already quite good, probably a simple ensemble would get some good performance. It's not necessarily the case on Chameleon 17. So it depends on the dataset.
Okay,
I have one question, if I may ask.
Yeah, sure.
So Matthew, did you compare against the baseline where every center would compute their own model without any communication whatsoever?
Yes, in fact, this is the local line here. Sorry if I didn't.
That's what it is. Okay. Okay. So I didn't understand it. Okay, good.
Okay, so it seems there are no other questions. You can continue.
Okay, thanks a lot. Okay, so now I'm going to go into more advanced biostatistical models used in clinical research, which are summarized under the umbrella term survival analysis. And again, What I'm going to present is summarized in this paper that you can find in archive, which was written with colleagues from Hawkin, André Manuel, Romuald Menuet, Charlie Sahar, and Chloe Simpson, and which was presented at the ICML-FL workshop this year. Okay, so survival analysis. So in the previous part, I've presented a slide or tile classification. So you had a slide or say a part of a slide, and the goal was to say, is it a tumor or not? Well, in fact, from a clinical research perspective, this isn't a real task of interest. What we would like to do is, given this initial biopsy and knowing that it's a cancer, because getting to know if it's a cancer or not is not that easy, is not that difficult. What you'd like to be able to guess is the outcome over time of this cancer. How long, what's going to be the probability distribution of, say, of death of this person over time. Why is this important? Because if we're able to devise, for instance, a risk score for the different patients, or we're able to get this probability distribution of death, we will be able, given the initial biopsy, to identify high risk versus low risk patients. And it's very useful for two reasons. First, in present clinical practice, it can help to better allocate treatment. Because, for instance, for high-risk patients, then you're going to give the best treatments that you have. But for low-risk patients, maybe you're not going to give the best one because it has a lot of adverse effects, and you want to also your patients to have quite to minimize the amount of adverse effects. And then, as I mentioned, because with this risk score, you can also optimize the clinical trial, and this can help for finding better future treatments. Okay, so in this part, my goal will be to go from survival analysis, which are roughly presented before, but I'm going to go more into the detail now, and bridge the gap with federated learning. Because we would like to do it in a federated learning fashion, because we do not have a lot of data locally, we have some, but we'd like to benefit from as many data points as possible. And so we'd like to train it in a federated fashion. Now, what's survival analysis? So in survival analysis, the problem is formalized as follows. You've got individuals which are characterized by two quantities. They have covariates or features, which are simply, you can use them in some vector space, but it's not compulsory. For instance, Xi here represents your input slide of the patient as the initial diagnostic. And then there is some random event time, which is a random variable, which is a positive value, following, for instance, the diagnosis. For instance, it is your death time. And what is interesting is the conditional probability distribution of the random event conditioned on the value of the covariate. And what we'd like to identify typically is to get, for instance, here this is an example of a patient which is low risk because it survives for a long time, versus here a profile, a group of patients which die pretty quickly. The probability of surviving after this point is smaller than here. So they are high risk. And we'd like to be able, like this, to infer this probability distribution to get high-risk patients versus low-risk patients. So this quantity is interesting, but in fact, for modeling purposes, what people use, biostatisticians use, is the hazard function, which is just a derivative of the log of this survival function. We call it also the instantaneous death rate. Okay, so this is the quantity that I'm going to talk about in the remaining of this talk. It's just a derivative of the log of probability of dying, of surviving up to some point. An issue in survival analysis is that you have some missing information, which is known as censorship. Because for some patients, you know the input covariate, and you observe that at some point the event occurred, and you record it as Ti. But for some other patients, you only record sometime Tj, but in fact, you know that it wasn't the real event, and the real event occurred sometime after it, mainly even in the future, but it didn't occur at Tj. The reason for this censored patients, censored information, is that there are some patients which drop out of the studies. For instance, because if we're looking at a clinical trial for cancer treatments, then maybe if you gave a bad treatment, or say a treatment which doesn't work well, or even a placebo to a patient, maybe you want to drop him or her out at some point to treat him or her, which makes sense. Or I don't know, the person moved in another country and change the place it was treated, or any other reason. And this complicates the analysis because typically the number of actual events is quite low already. The good part is that the censorship status is known, so we know if a patient is censored. One of the most famous models for survival analysis is the Cox proportional hazard model, which was proposed a long time ago, which I'm gonna call the Cox model to simplify. So it makes an assumption on the hazard function from the previous slide, this expression, and it assumes that it has a proportional hazard, meaning that all hazards of the different x are proportional to one another with a constant lambda 0 of t, which only depends on time as an independent feature, whereas you have a feature component which is independent of time. The good properties of this model is that both quantities can be estimated independently. Lambda 0 can be estimated by the Kaplan-Meier estimator, which requires no optimization at all. Whereas the beta parameter here can be estimated by minimizing some partial log likelihood, which has this expression. So you sum across the different samples, and then you've got some expression for each given sample versus beta. And it's nice because it's a convex loss function. You want to minimize it. Even if you're a distributing setting, supposedly you're good, right? Except you're not, because this loss function is non-separable. More precisely, if you look at it carefully, so it's a sum of all uncensored patients. But in each term for I, there is another sum, and this sum involves index j, which is different than I. And since we're in an FL setting, say we have only two centers, if we decompose this sum, then there will be some intra-center terms with j belonging to the same center as I, and there will be some inter-center terms where j will not belong to the same center as I. And it's okay to compute intra-center terms, but the issue is to compute the inter-center terms. Even computing this loss function is impossible without sharing the individual times, or say the exponential beta transpose xj, which is already getting quite sensitive with respect to the initial features. And so we're really here facing a non-separability. So the loss cannot be written as a sum of local losses, and we're not fitting the FL framework. So to sum up, we're interested in this Cox model. We like to go to the phylogenetic setting, but we are facing this non-separability issue of the loss function. What do we do? So maybe, in fact, this non-separability isn't really an issue, and we can try to go through it. So let's keep only the intra-center term. So we're going to approximate this loss function with a sum of local losses, where each local loss reads exactly as the same expression as here, except that we restrict it to the individual indices of this center. Okay. And in fact, so we can try this naive approach. And when you look at it from a statistical perspective, the interpretation is that the proportional hazard hypothesis that I mentioned before only holds per center. And this is not the Cox model, it is a stratified Cox model, which is also a well-known model, but it's not the Cox model. So we can give it a try anyway. So we are testing, trying to minimize this loss function. And we're computing on synthetic IID data, where you will have 5 different centers. All of them have censored and uncensored data with the same distributions, both in the features and in the response times. And here are the results of C-index, which is a measure akin to AUC, and which shares the same properties, so higher is better. This is the performance for pooled, so all the data put in a single place. This is the local performance on the different centers not communicating with one another on average. And this is the performance of this approach. What you can see is that it's quite good. In fact, it's getting the same result as pool, so why not using it? Well, in fact, if we change a little bit the data distribution, and we consider here a very particular adversarial example, where the distributions of the responses are very different, then we observe a very large drop in performance from between the pooled, between the naive FL in the IID and non-IID setting, whereas pooled does the same because it's the same distribution on average. And this is we observe it in this particular adversarial example. In fact, we have also tested it in a more realistic setting of simply having affine covariance shifts, and we also have this kind of drops. So to sum up, we've tried to go with a naive approach, and it doesn't work. It's not non-resilient to heterogeneity in some corner cases. And because we are looking at a federated learning approach, we cannot always look at data. So it's quite difficult, and your data provider doesn't want you to let you look at it. So you want to have an approach which is very resilient. You go with you want something which is as robust as possible. Maybe we can find another model inspired from this one, which works as well, and which doesn't suffer from this issue. So what we considered is the so-called discrete time Cox model, because since we're having in survival analysis, we're having some event times. We are looking at here diseases, and it's quite likely that the times that are reported are discrete. For instance, it's maybe days, months, years of survival. And so they belong to a finite grid. And if you look at the conditional survival probability distribution, it is piecewise constant on this grid. And recall that the hazard function is the derivative of the log of this survival function. And because it's its derivative, you're going to end up with some sum of Dirac's, weighted sum. And here you're going to have different weights, which may depend on the feature, but the times are going to be fixed. And in fact, when you compute what this individual weight is, it's going to represent the conditional death probability, the probability of dying at this time, knowing that the individual survived until this time. And in this setting, one can also make a discrete Cox assumption, where it's the same kind of expression, where you have this conditional death probability, which reads up to a change of variable to get something which scales between 0 and infinity, of a product of time and features. And if you rewrite this expression, you end up with a logistic model with a time-dependent bias and a time-independent feature. Okay, so the discrete time Cox model reads like this. You have a sum of condition. What matters is to compute the conditional death probabilities because you already know the grid. And what matters is to find this time-dependent bias and these time-independent features. How are we going to do it? Well, recall that we have some data. So I'm going to here present the so-called stacking method from Zhong and Tipchirny. So we have some xi, which are the features at the onset of the disease. And we know that there was some event which was observed on the grid at, say, some Sn. We're going to introduce some extra variables. The first one is going to be YIM. So for this individual, we're going to create one variable per time point, which is going to be 0 if there was no event at this time, and 1 if there was an event at this time. And similarly, we're going to create an extra variable on the feature part, where at each time point, we're going to concatenate the features xi with a canonical vector em, which is 0 everywhere except at the time index of the time point we're looking at. And these two variables allow to rewrite this expression and to get a nice formulation as follows. First, by construction of this YIM, you observe that the probability of it being 1 is simply the probability of dying at this time point, knowing that you survived before. And by construction, definition of this quantity, this is simply PM of xi. But because we have assumed this discrete time Cox model, we can replace it here with this expression. And if we stack all the alpha m in a given vector, using the XIM, we can rewrite it as sigma of some vector concatenated transpose XIM. So if we take the left-hand side and the right-hand side, we end up with probability of YIM equal 1 is the sigmoid function times a vector scalar product with this XIM, meaning that we end up with a logistic classification model. So fitting a discrete time model can be done by reformulating it as a classification model on extra variables, which fits into the FL framework. So to sum up, we have taken the continuous time model, we have changed it into a discrete time model, which is not exactly equivalent, but at least the hypothesis of Cox holds on all centers. And one can show that it can be reformulated as a classification problem on extra variable, and it fits into the standard FL framework, so we circumvent this non-separability issue. Now, what does it give on XPMS? So remember, on the synthetic IAD data, we got these results for the naive FL, pool data, and the local centers without any communication. Now, this is the performance of the discrete time model, which is roughly of the same order. It's slightly different because it isn't exactly the same model, but it's of the same order. And when we go into this synthetic adversarial setting, here we retain the same performance. Because we are not making local Cox assumptions, we are still making a global Cox assumption. Now, we have also done experiments on real data on the concept, from the concept genome atlas. We're also reporting C indices, so higher is better. And so TCGA has both tabular data, so just we're just applying a linear model. And these are the different cancer types. This is in-center generalization and out-of-center generalization. And what we get is that all methods roughly get the same results. There are some variations, but roughly it's the same. Next, we also studied on histopathology data and compared to the approach where one trains locally, one trains with all the data pools. So the proposed approach is also on par with this. It gets maybe 1 or 2 points more, but this is due to the differences in models. And so the proposed method is equivalent to pooled. So we fit into the FL framework and it works, basically. Okay, so to sum up this part, we have investigated how to bridge a gap between survival analysis and federated learning, looking in particular at the Cox model. The naive way of federating it was non-resilient to heterogeneity, and so we had to go through a reformulation of this model to circumvent this issue. Are there any questions on this part?
Okay, we have one question from Hassan. Please go ahead.
Yeah, I have one question. So, so the experiments that was done with deep learning models at these different centers, was there any cross-validation involved, or how are these results robust to any randomization of training testing data?
Yes, thank you. In fact, this is a good question. In fact, in these results over here, and here we're always looking at cross-validation. And these are I mean, this is a distribution of the cross-validation results. And also we've done cross-validation and also with multiple restarts each time. And this is cross-validation within each center. So we're separating within each center between train and test. And this is where we put one center completely aside and we train on all the remaining centers and we test on average each time.
Okay, thanks.
There is no other question.
Okay. Okay, thank you, Sam. Okay, so I'm going to conclude very quickly. So to sum up, if you go back to the big picture that I presented before of this collaborative federated learning, with the different challenges that I presented. In this presentation, I've mainly presented contributions related to the machine learning, federation of some machine learning problem and the interplay with heterogeneity. And we've looked at with the so-called siloed FL approach, as well as the survival analysis of a Cox model. But in fact, there are still many open problems on all these ML aspects and their interplay. So for instance, when you want to do privacy, but you want to reduce the communication costs, heterogeneity with communication also, so there's a nice interplay here. So these are on the machine learning aspects, but in fact, in all the system aspects, there are really very nice questions. How do you make sure that your infrastructure is trustful? Basically, how can you trust the system? It's very important. It's a co-repetitive framework. And in fact, in particular, in this setting where data isn't produced by softwares, but produced by humans in the loop with different standards in different centers, there's really a need to have this interdisciplinary approach to create a federated data science workflow. And the end goal is really to facilitate scientific discovery, not only for clinical research, but I think it can also play a role in a lot of many different fields. Thanks a lot for your attention.
Thanks a lot, Mathieu. We're gonna check whether there are more questions. Maybe I can ask one while maybe other people think about questions. So thanks a lot for the interesting talk. My question is, I guess, is a bit high level, more in terms of methodology. So I think in the two cases that you presented, you basically start with a model, okay, that makes sense for clinical research that you would like to run in the federated learning setting, realize that it doesn't really fit. And I think in both cases, your solution is essentially in the modeling, right? So you get away, so to speak, by reformulating slightly maybe the model in a way that makes it amenable to maybe existing algorithms, which I think is quite nice. I was wondering whether maybe this in some situation can be a problem. So I guess that people in clinical research and clinicians in general, they have their favorite models, right? And maybe they have habits, and maybe in their community, okay, they have to use a particular model to convince other people that what they do makes sense for the problem, or I don't know, I've seen that a bit. So maybe in some situations, people are not really willing to change the modeling, basically. So I was wondering whether you have experienced situations like that. And of course, in these cases, it's also interesting to maybe discuss more about these specific cases, because for people who do more of the algorithms, like fundamental federated learning part, of course, this creates nice opportunities for maybe devising new algorithms or extending algorithms also. Okay, so I was wondering whether you thought a bit about that, and what is the situation in practice you think in clinical research? I think your mic is off.
Thanks. Thanks. It's a nice question. In fact, yes, the ideal setting that you'd like to have is really to take a model which is the one that the data science expert or the biostatistician wants to use, and simply to federate it in a black box fashion and get the results. That's what we'd like to have. And it's true that we have, in what I've shown, we have been forced to adapt the results. Well, basically, it can be an issue, but if there is no other solution, it's better than nothing. But if you have ideas on how to, in fact, how to solve this, for instance, this non-separability issue without, especially in a communication efficient and private fashion, there is also, there's a question of finding the right formalization of the problem, because here we had a non-separable loss, but in a very specific fashion. And there's the question of finding patterns which you find in different problems, so that you can get a general methodology for working out these kind of issues. If you have some ideas, I'm really excited about them.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I think the non-separability aspects are quite interesting, actually. So on a personal note, I would be quite interested in in discussing those a bit. So it went also a bit fast for me. So I'm not sure I grasped fully the nature exactly of this non-separability and where it comes from. But yeah. So that's interesting. I agree. I think we have a question on the chat. Samuel, maybe you can unmute Giovanna.
Yes, I'm trying. Yeah. Okay, you're unmuted, Giovanna.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, thanks for the awesome presentation. I was just wondering, because this whole field is new for me, so I just want to understand whether the main source of data heterogeneity actually comes from different staining techniques, as you mentioned before. So in each center, we have different looking images and different RGB distributions. So I was wondering whether we can just use different image format instead of RGB, like lab, where you have actually grayscale as the first channel and other two as a mixture of others.
Thanks. It's a good question. So, color variations is the most obvious one. It's not the only source of heterogeneity. When you look at the images, there are also issues in terms of zoom levels and also in terms of blurrings, which may vary according to the scanner that you have. But it's the one which is the most obvious. It's true that there exists some color normalization techniques, but they may require to use some advanced segmentation methods to renormalize each type of cells. So you want to renormalize the nuclei, you want to renormalize each different part differently. And having something which is embedded in the network with batch normalization instead of doing all this heavy preprocessing, knowing that you cannot really verify it because you cannot look at the data, was something that we really were interested in.
Okay,
another sorry.
Yeah, I was curious whether the experimenting with different image format is actually a thing, or you're just trying to optimize it in different way.
I'm sorry. So we did not investigate the use of this normalization. They exist, but we ruled them out simply because they are not completely practical in this setting. To do them, they require a lot of calibration.
Okay, thank you.